So as most of you know, almost all of my projects are either practical in nature or serve some sort of purpose around my home. This one absolutely is not. This one's just for fun. Boom! Let me show you how I built it. The first step in this project was to start on the deck of the mountain board, and to do this I cut several strips of 1/8 inch thick plywood to eventually be laminated together on a form much like I did in my curvy board video for my daughter. Once my form was finished, I then laid out all of my pieces of plywood and proceeded to cover them with a ton of glue and start to laminate them. I ended up doing this in two different sections. This first section was 4 layers thick. I waited about 48 hours and then I added 3 more sections for a total thickness of 7 1/8 inch pieces of plywood. So the finished board was almost 1 inch thick. As for the clamping, all I can say is the more clamps you have, the better. I used a bunch of clamps and pieces of wood and then just took my time to make sure that everything was nice and even and the pressure was pretty consistent throughout. After I was finished laminating all of the layers of plywood, I then took the board to the table saw, cut off both sides, and then proceeded to trim the ends with my table saw sled. Then I added some simple corner cuts and then did a bunch of sanding to smooth everything out. After the sanding was complete, I added some accent stripes, and I just did this with some stain by using a very dry brush and using some tape lines to keep the stain from bleeding through. And I think the finished result looked pretty good. Once the board was finished, I then started on the trucks, or essentially the mechanical hardware of the board, and I did this by using some square tube steel that I had left over from a fencing project. And basically what I was going to do is make 2 series of opposing triangles that could pivot on one another, and you'll kind of see how that happens here in just a second. Now for the axles of the board, I'm using 1/2 inch threaded rod, and this smaller square tube is simply acting as a bolster or a support for that threaded rod to go through and then eventually attach to one of those triangles that I was cutting earlier. And to give myself a better mounting surface, I'm welding a square plate to 1/2 of the triangle trucks that will eventually get mounted to the underside of the board. And here's where those triangles are going to start looking a little bit more like skateboard or mountain board trucks. You'll see I drilled a hole for the pivot, and then right here I'm mounting that axle tube to the bottom of one of the trucks. And once I put them together, you're going to kind of see how they are going to start to work. After the paint was dry, I was ready to mount the assembly to the bottom of the board, and you'll see I added 2 brand new bolts on the lower side of that triangle, and what those are there for is to help retain the eventual springs that I'm going to be putting on either side of the pivoting portion of the board. And as always, you'll see that in just a second. And here's where the truck assembly really starts to come together. I'm adding a bolt at the hinge or pivot point, and then a little steel spacer that is going to go around that bolt and in between both of those triangle pieces to keep them aligned and from shifting while the truck is actually pivoting. For the suspension portion of the truck assembly, I ended up using some compression springs that I got from my local Ace Hardware. Ultimately, these springs ended up being way too weak for the board, but I have since replaced them with some much sturdier springs. But overall, I'm very happy with the way the truck assembly is able to turn the wheels, and you'll see that here in a second. And for the wheels to the board, I'm just using some standard 10-inch utility pneumatic tires that I got from Harbor Freight for about $3 a tire with a super coupon. And here is the board in action with the turning mechanism, and you can see it still has the really weak springs, but it does work pretty darn well.
This freaking thing's heavy.
Are you filming? And if you like this project, guys, here are a couple other projects that might interest you as well that involve the same type of lamination. This first is a pallet wood axe handle, and this next one is a curvy board that I made for my daughter using the same 1/8 inch thick plywood that I used in this project. So as always, guys, thanks for watching, and please subscribe for future updates, and we'll see you next time.